Hello, and welcome to the Maison Française of New York University. My name is Phillip John Usher. This is the 12th episode of our series, Conversations with People Who Read Montaigne. Thank you so much for joining us today. Vous êtes nombreux. Today, my guest is Mary McKinley. Mary McKinley is the Douglas Huntley Gordon Distinguished Professor Emerita of French at the University of Virginia, where she taught between 1974 and 2004. Mary has published on a whole host of French Renaissance authors, including Rabelais, Christine de Pisan, Jean Le Maire de Belge, Maurice Sèvres, Marie Dantière, best known for her Épître très utile of 1539, Louise Labbé, and many others. She's particularly well known as a reader and scholar of Marguerite de Navarre, and of course, and hence her presence here today, Michel de Montaigne. Mary has, over the decades, made a major contribution to the study of Marguerite de Navarre. There is the 1993 volume that she co-edited with John Lyons, Critical Tales, which has been said to have inaugurated, quote, the modern renaissance of scholarly work on Marguerite de Navarre, inspiring a groundswell of serious new work on one of the great Renaissance writers. More recently, she co-edited with Gary Ferguson, a companion to Marguerite de Navarre, which appeared in 2013. And even more recently than that, together with Nicholas Russell, she is completing a new translation of the Heptameron, for which she prepared the notes and introduction. Let us turn then specifically to Mary's work on Montaigne. Mary completed her dissertation about Montaigne at Rutgers under the direction of Jack Undank in the 1970s. Titled Montaigne and Words, The Evolution of the Concept of Language in the Essais, said dissertation quickly established Mary as an authority on the essayist. In an article for the Bulletin de la Société des Amis de Montaigne, the grandfather of Montaigne studies in the United States, Donald Frame, referred to it as, quote, the best American dissertation on Montaigne of the decade. In 1981, Mary published Words in a Corner, Studies in Montaigne's Latin Quotations, which studies a selection of the more than 1,000 Latin quotations that Montaigne scatters throughout the pages of the essay. More specifically, the 3 chapters of Words in a Corner focus respectively on the complex ways in which Montaigne quotes, directly or indirectly, 3 specific authors, namely Ovid, Horace, and Virgil. In each of these chapters, Mary makes sure always to look in 2 directions at once, which is to say both at the Latin source text, not just the words that Montaigne may quote, but the whole context in which these words first appeared, and at Montaigne's text, where the Latin text may or may not retain its original set of resonances, but whose meaning is always greater when seen in this double perspective. The first chapter on Ovid takes us into several chapters, 1-2, De la tristesse, on sadness, 2-12, L'apologie, the apology, 2-11, De la cruauté, on cruelty. In the first of these, Montaigne is explicit. In the final one, Montaigne's allusion to the myth of Actaeon is indeed oblique. The second chapter on Horace emphasizes how Montaigne's use of quotation can be subversive, comparing Montaigne's use of Horace in 1-8, de l'oisiveté, 1-28, de l'amitié on affectionate relationships, and 2-17, de la présomption on presumption. Mary shows us just how much we gain as readers of the essay when we know the Latin texts he quotes, sometimes to say precisely the opposite of what they originally meant. The third chapter on Virgil looks at 1-8, de l'oisiveté on idleness, 2-6, de l'exercitation on practice, and most extensively, as you might guess, 3-5, sur des vers de Virgile on some lines of Virgil. When Words in a Corner first appeared, it received glowing reviews. Donald Frame called it an excellent book and a coup de maître, and Edwin Duval lauded it as highly suggestive, intelligent, well-written, and generous. It's interesting to reread these reviews. They praise Words in a Corner, but they also hesitate over Mary's discussion of Wolfgang Iser's reader response theory. And in doing so, they somewhat inadvertently register something very important about the book, one of its great accomplishments, which is to say Mary's desire to empower the reader to make the essays their own. In response to Mary's assertion that the reader must feel free to reshape Montaigne's text and use it to create a new form that will be as uniquely personal a representation of the reader as the essay are of their author, Donald Frame thus expresses his hesitation. For me, says Frame, Montaigne's suffisant lecteur should illuminate or enrich a text, not alter it. Likewise, Duval quips, Mary goes too far when she argues for the legitimacy of multivalent readings according to the suffisance of each individual reader. Antoine Compagnon, too, responded similarly in a review for the Revue d'Histoire littéraire de la France. If I linger on this, it's not to get into a discussion about Wolfgang Iser or of the first readers of Words in a Corner, but merely to emphasize the book's emancipatory boldness. Mary's second book on Montaigne is titled Les Terrains Vagues des Essais, which we might render as something like the wastelands in the essays, or something to that effect. Originally published in 1996 by Champion and thankfully re-released by Classique Garnier in 2022, Les Terrains Vagues is a smart, subtle, and indeed beautiful book, and surely a book that is hard to summarize in just a few words. It takes very seriously the difficulty of articulating the relationship between the world of books and the world tout court, and it plots out various ways in which l'espace du monde and l'espace des livres, the space of the world and the space of books, reach towards each other, with attention here focused throughout on the terrain vague, places at times real, at times imaginary, sometimes metaphorical, into which Montaigne enters in order to write, places that are imprecise, misunderstood, marginal, sometimes seductive, sometimes menacing. The first chapter, Paysages de l'esprit, Landscapes of the Mind, opens with a claim that supports the rest of the book, namely that, quote, in the essay, Montaigne draws a landscape of the mind. But not a landscape created once and for all, but a landscape that is itself part of the thinking. Le mouvement vers la connaissance dans les essais est un parcours qui traverse en méandre de tels paysages. The movement towards knowledge in the essay is a pathway that meanders through such landscapes. In other words, the heuristic process takes place in and through the uncertain places, real or other, through which the author moves. Still in the first chapter, Mary seeks out a connection between such landscapes and landscape painting by the likes of Flemish painter Patinier, in which, as art historians have argued, landscape leaves the background of the painting to occupy the foreground. In such a reading, landscapes thus become, quote, un instrument de travail dans l'aventure épistémologique à laquelle Montaigne incite ses lecteurs, a work tool that is part of the epistemological adventure to which Montaigne brings his readers. Other chapters of Les Terrains Vagues build on these opening suggestions in various ways. Chapter 2, for example, after developing somewhat further the term vague in terrain vague, turns to the Latin poems by Etienne de la Boétie about the New World, whose landscapes, says Mary, Montaigne seems to have interiorized as he himself came to write of the Americas. Chapter 3 opens with 217, De la Présomption, on presumption, in which appears the figure of the labyrinth, which Mary reads as a metaphor of Montaigne's quest, and which leads back to Ovid and forward to the Essais. Montaigne, Mary shows, knew the labyrinth as both Theseus and Daedalus, and he knew that it promises both confusion and order, danger, and beauty. Chapters 4 and 5 turn to Raymond de Sebon and the Apologie. Chapter 6, La Bulle de la Vanité, originally published as Vanity's Bull, has already been mentioned in this series of conversations. Jeff Purcell listed it as one of his all-time favorite pieces about the essayist. And it is indeed fabulous, but I will intentionally not tell you more about it right now. Chapter 7 also looks at de la vanité, and the final chapter, chapter 8, looks at the figure of the vagabond. Les Terrains Vagues is a fabulous book, which brings us very close to Montaigne as he writes and thinks in the many imprecise and uncertain places and spaces scattered throughout the essay. Unlike in Words in a Corner, Mary's focus is on Montaigne's relationship with his contemporaries, but it is also much more than that, for as I read it, it struggles with the even more fundamental question. By asking where Montaigne thinks, it also asks how he thinks. At the risk of talking as much about just one chapter as about a whole book, I should like nonetheless to take a moment to speak of a chapter that Mary contributed to Philippe Dezan's Oxford Handbook on Montaigne in 2015, titled Montaigne on Women. Although short, it is encyclopedic and absolutely the first go-to piece of scholarly writing on this important topic, and a chapter to be recommended as essential reading to all of Montaigne's readers. As Mary notes at the start, within a single chapter of the essay, Montaigne can slide between what Floyd Gray called an inherited rhetoric of misogyny and other quite different positions, in which Montaigne sometimes aligned himself quite squarely with women. In the first section, Mary analyzes several chapters that demonstrate this flip-flopping of opinion, starting with 1.1, Par divers moyens on arrive à pareille fin, we reach the same end by discrepant means, and 128, De l'amitié, on affectionate relationships, 3.3, De trois commerces, on three kinds of social intercourse, and at some length, 3.5, Sur des vers de Virgile, on some lines of Virgil. Throughout, Mary brings out the back and forth of opinions, for example, reminding us to be careful how we read the end of 3.5. There, Montaigne famously writes, Les mâles et femelles sont jetés en même moule, sauf l'institution et l'usage, la différence n'y est pas grande. Male and female are cast in the same mold, save for education and custom, the differences between them is not great. As much as we might want this to be Montaigne's final word on the question, Mary reminds us that it's not. It should not, she says, be mistaken for the definitive statement about women in the essay. A second section of the chapter explores the various direct addresses that Montaigne makes to noble women, especially in the form of chapter dedications. Thus, we come across Diane de Foix, to whom he dedicates 126, De l'Institution des Enfants, on educating children, Montaigne's neighbor, Madame d'Estissac, to whom he gives 2:8 de l'affection des pères aux enfants, on the affection of fathers for their children. Diane d'Ondoin, the dedicatee of the 29 sonnets by La Boétie, intended to occupy the space of 129, as well, of course, as the anonymous princess in 212, the Apology, who is most likely Marguerite de Valois. As Mary puts it, these dedications to noblewomen should be understood in the context of Montaigne's position in the turbulent political situation of the late 1570s, especially his relationship to the noble families whose daughters and wives he addresses. The men close to the women had the power to advance Montaigne in that hierarchy. They represented different and sometimes shifting positions on the political spectrum. He wrote all of those women into his book while preparing its first publication in 1580 in Bordeaux. Although we may think of the 1570s as the years of his retreat from public life, they were years of strategic preparation for his return. He carefully enlisted noblewomen to accompany the 1580 Essais into the world. A third section, finally, studies the women who surrounded Montaigne in his daily life, especially his mother, wife, and daughter, none of whom are granted more than fleeting glances. As François Charpentier put it, quoted by Mary, this is un silence éclatant, a deafening silence. He mentions his mother, Antoinette, only twice, and linking her each time with his father, never naming her or giving the least personal detail about her. He says little more about his wife, Françoise. He dedicates to her his edition of Plutarch's condolences to his wife on the death of their child, but says not a word about her when talking about the death and infancy of his own children. His daughter, Léonore, likewise receives little attention in the essay. Mary does quote, however, and I cannot resist reading it out myself here, a fleeting glance from chapter 123. De la coutume de ne changer aisément une loi reçue, on habit and on never easily changing a traditional law. I quote, there is no pastime so trivial that I do not bring to it an extreme repugnance against cheating. If I am playing cards, I treat pennies like double doubloons just as much when playing with my wife and daughter as when I am gambling in earnest. Fourthly, Mary tells us about two women without whom we would not know the essay as we do, which is to say his fille d'alliance, Marie de Gournay, who after Montaigne's death spent 15 months at Montaigne's Château to prepare the first posthumous edition published in 1595, and who saw a whopping 22 subsequent editions into print, while also bringing her own productive career, building her own productive career as a writer in Paris. And then, closer to our own time, Grace Norton, who played a crucial role in promoting the essay to an American public. Mary's chapter quotes and responds to various studies about women and gender in the essay, including various articles by Kathleen Beauchatz and the 2015 book by Isabelle Krier, Montaigne et le genre instable, providing a superb introduction to these very complex issues. And I note in passing, we can now read alongside that chapter the 2024 issue of Montaigne Studies on Montaigne and Gender. There will be much more to say to properly introduce Mary, but I have spoken enough and it is best I stop here so that we can hear directly from her. Before we continue, a quick reminder that each episode of this series is divided into 3 parts. In a first moment, Mary will answer my Montaigne questionnaire. In a second moment, she will be sharing with us some of her work on Montaigne. And the third and final moment will be one of discussion with you who are joining us by Zoom. Please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point from now until the end of this episode. I will be reading them out when we get to the third part of the episode. Et n'hésitez pas à rédiger vos questions en français, bien sûr. So, without further ado, it's time for the Montaigne Questionnaire. My first question to you, Mary, is the following. When, how, and why did you first read Montaigne's essays?
Okay.
There we go.
Unmuted? Ready?
Unmuted. Perfect.
Okay, good. So, well, thank you very much, Philip, for that kind, that generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So, I read selections from the essays in undergraduate courses and liked them, but it was only during a course with Alfred Glauser at the University of Wisconsin that I fell in love with Montaigne, and I decided that I wanted to learn much more about him, to study him. Then, after a few years' absence, I started my doctoral program at Rutgers and had the very good fortune to be in a seminar on Montaigne led by Donald Frame. I blush to remember that it was a total coincidence. When a friend told me the day that I arrived that, that Donald Frame would be offering a seminar on Montaigne, I asked, Who is Donald Frame?
I love that story.
Yeah.
Uh, there's always a part of chance in how people come to Montaigne, I think. Which of the chapters of the essay is the one that over the years you find yourself returning to, Mary? And maybe it's the same question, maybe it's not, but which is your favorite chapter of the essay?
Well, that would be De la Vanité on vanity. It's a chapter that Alfred Glauser clearly loved, and that love was contagious. I was first struck by Montaigne's desire to travel to foreign places, and once there, to avoid fellow French travelers and endeavor to talk with people of the area, the others. Then I was seduced by the way his writing, his style mirrored the way he said he liked to travel. And his one famous sentence of Montaigne, Je m'égare, mais plutôt par licence que par mégarde. And that complex interplay has continued to fascinate me. I stray from the path, but on purpose rather than accidentally.
Mm. Question number 3. Why do you think we should read Montaigne today in 2024?
Well, Montaigne in his essays expresses convictions, but he also questions those convictions and opens them for his readers' scrutiny and for his own. I think my opinions are good and healthy, he says, but adds, but who doesn't think as much of his opinions? The Essays encourages its readers to read widely and engage with books from the distant past as well as the present. And I think that's very important today. It's a book that reflects on turbulent and violent events and on one man's efforts to live and write in the midst of those events. Montaigne lived at a time when one very powerful group of French people wanted to get rid of a smaller, less powerful group within the borders of France. I think of Valérie Dionne's reporting on Montaigne's efforts towards conciliation. So the essay speaks to readers today who are living through their own troubling times and trying to find a way to navigate them. Finally, the essays are beautiful. Montaigne has a way with words. And just recently, and I have to share this with you, I saw an ad for a book and I ordered it for the library, thinking it would be a very small book when it arrived. And when it came, I found this. En bonne santé avec Montaigne. It's a thick book written by a psychiatrist, and the form of the book is a series of interviews that the psychiatrist has with a woman patient coincidentally named Marie. So I think we need good health, and that Montaigne, especially in these times, and that Montaigne is a great way to improve our health.
Beautifully put, Mary. Absolutely. The health of our health and the health of the collectivity.
Yeah.
So, fourth and final question. Which is the article or book about Montaigne which you did not write that you most often recommend to students, colleagues, or friends? Or maybe you just answered this question, I'm not sure.
Well, I haven't had a chance to recommend that book to too many people yet, but it would be very tough to limit my answer to one book. I was fortunate to begin my years as a professor and scholar of French Renaissance literature at a time when there were several wonderful people in our field. Slightly older scholars who had recently published game-changing books. I think of Bob Cottrell, Richard Regeson, Michel Jeanneret, Terence Cave, François Rigolot, Tom Conley, Gérald Nakam, and André Tournon, among others. At first, I knew them just as names, and their books stood together on the library reserved shelf for my students. But later, they became a community of friends who welcomed and supported me. As a very good introduction to Montaigne for students, colleagues or friends, there was, and still is, Montaigne's Essays, A Critical Introduction by Richard Sayce. Well, that was all 50 years ago when I first began teaching. And as for today, there are quite a few what I call younger scholars, they're all younger than I am, who are doing exciting work on Montaigne. And I dare not risk their trying to say their names because I'm afraid I will forget someone. But I will mention one book, and that's you've already mentioned, and that's by a scholar whom I've never met. And that's Isabelle Krier's Montaigne et le genre instable, which I discovered to my great good fortune just as I was writing that article for the Phillip John companion. That book would never have been published 50 years ago. And it's a wonderful, I like it very, very much. And it's a book that I'm very pleased to think has been published and can be published today. And other writers writing on that topic, both in France and the United States, have something to offer to us.
Fantastic recommendations and what a lineup of stars. It's time for you to share some of your work with us. So I'm just going to hand over the microphone. I'm going to mute myself. If I don't bring up images at the right time, you just shout out to me and I'll make sure that happens.
Okay. All right, good.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. So there are two aspects of Montaigne's writing that continue to fascinate me. One is the way Montaigne articulates his thought processes. He presents his mind as moving into and through a landscape. And at the same time, he conveys his passion for reading by repeatedly inviting books into his own essays, most obviously by quotations, but also in other more subtle ways. And your invitation has allowed me to go back to that book on Montaigne, Les Terrains Vagues des Essais, and to sort of rethink it, maybe update it a little bit in my own mind. And so I think of those two kind of axes, moving through landscape and welcoming the writings of others. So first, the landscapes. Some examples. There is the harsh and thorny path to virtue on cruelty. Then there's the moving stream that his judgment tests before he will ford it in that striking introduction to On Democritus and Heraclitus. There's the beautiful, fertile, and flowering plain of philosophy, in the education of children. The mountains that put boundaries around truth in the Apology. The river Dordogne with its shifting banks on cannibals. The road by elsewhere, La route par ailleurs, that André Tournon so beautifully explored. Sometimes the two converge, landscapes and books, as in this passage from On the Education of Children. This great world, which some multiply further as being only a species under one genus, is the mirror in which we must look at ourselves to recognize ourselves from the proper angle. So this great outside world is a mirror. By looking into it, Montaigne, and we along with him, can come to know ourselves better. In the brief poetic essay on idleness, Montaigne's metaphor suggests that the human mind is an unruly horse, out of control in the mental landscape of the imagination. So it is with minds. Unless you keep them busy with some definite subject that will bridle and control them, they will throw themselves hither and yon, unruly, in the vague field of the imagination. By that image, le vague champ de l'imagination, that undefined terrain where a sick man in his dreams can give birth to fantastic monsters, conveyed Montaigne's uneasy state of mind, his melancholy that finally prompted him to begin writing the essays. A little later, As he opens the essay on the education of children, he portrays his mind moving slowly, groping its way through a similar vague champ, a land with no clear end. My conceptions and my judgment move only by groping, staggering, stumbling, and blundering. And when I have gone ahead as far as I can, still I am not at all satisfied. I can still see a country beyond, but with a dim and clouded vision, so that I cannot clearly distinguish it. That country beyond, the pays au-delà, becomes an essential metaphor in the essays, one that conveys Montaigne's philosophical journeys as well as his physical ones. Montaigne's verbal landscapes may well have been prompted by the visual images of landscapes that became very popular during his lifetime. We know that he had paintings and probably prints in his Tower library, perhaps some of them products of Flemish artists. The new landscape flourished in Flemish painting, culminating in the works of Peter Bruegel the Elder, whose prints and drawings of alpine landscapes represent vast panoramas, large scenes of a world with distant horizons, some including little sketches of cities far away, expansive scenes that are called cosmic landscapes. Even the ones depicting saints, repentant Mary Magdalene, Saint Jerome in the desert, favor the large panorama and almost dwarf the saintly figure who occupies a tiny corner at the bottom right of the composition. And you can see that little figure there. So Montaigne may have had such landscapes in mind when he wrote this passage on the education of children. Whoever considers, as in a painting, the great picture of our Mother Nature in her full majesty, whoever reads such universal and constant variety in her face, whoever finds himself there, and not merely himself, but a whole kingdom, as a stroke made with a very fine brush, that man alone estimates things according to their true proportions. So in this one on your screen, Bruegel's large alpine landscape from 1554 or thereabouts, instead of a saint, we see a figure of a small man on a horse. I like to think of this little man in the picture as Montaigne, on his horse atop one of the Alps. He sees before him a vast scene. On the opposite slope, a meandering road, and in the valley below, a meandering river, much like my river Dordogne that he invokes at the beginning of his essay on cannibals. The distant horizon is unclear, suggesting that a country beyond beckons the traveling horseman. And here I send you back to September and Nina Mugler in her engaging conversation with Philip about her edition of Montaigne's travel journal. You can read on page 91 of that beautiful volume the secretary's description of a similar large alpine landscape, one that the secretary writes, "For Monsieur de Montaigne, this valley represented the most pleasing landscape that he had ever seen." But Montaigne had to push on to the pays au-delà, to that country far beyond the Alps. That country was Italy. And that provides my transition to the second part of my little causerie today, Montaigne's essays on vanity. I've said it is my favorite essay. It responds to all of the reasons I gave earlier that Montaigne speaks to readers in November 2024. And I think I will touch on all of them. It's the essay where he writes, if you will, his own large landscape, his verbal landscape, venturing into and towards the pays au-delà. Early on Vanity, he says, "Who does not see that I have taken a road along which I shall go, without stopping and without effort, as long as there is ink and paper in the world. And when shall I make an end of describing the continual agitations and changes of my thoughts, whatever subject they light on? In On Vanity, Montaigne focuses on his travels and on his book, often blurring the distinction between them, letting each one become a sort of metaphor for the other. That permeable bond between travels and books becomes a leitmotif in the essay, a kind of matrix into which he inserts other thoughts, but to which he returns again and again. But this intimate association between writing and travel in this essay does not progress simply on a thematic level. It deeply informs both the style and the structure of the essay. I noticed many years ago that the original 1588 version of the essay evolves by reproducing, redrawing, if you will, the real geographical itinerary of Montaigne's journey through France from his chateau in the southwest, first up to the region of Paris and around Paris, and then on to Rome. Those three road markers divide the essay into sections, about 20 pages between the chateau and Paris, the beautiful description of Paris that I won't go into today, another 20 pages between Paris and Rome, with 2 pages of introduction, more or less, and 2 or 3 pages of ending, perhaps conclusion, after he set those 3 points of references. He leaves us with practically no descriptions of the countryside he sees along the way, and that's true throughout the essays. There are very few detailed verbal landscapes in the essays talking about a specific place. We need to go to the travel journal for those passages. Instead, he places observations about himself and his times and his writing between and among them in that matrix. Prominent among those are his remarks about the sorry state of France. But there should be some, and again I'm quoting, but there should be some legal restraint against inept and useless writers, as there is against vagabonds and idlers. They would banish from the hands of our people, both me and 100 others. When did we write so much as when our troubles began? This is not a joke. That's Montaigne who says that. This is not a joke. And indeed, it's not a joke. That passage always stops me in my tracks. Our troubles are the wars over religion that had torn France apart officially since 1562, and more generally since the 1520s, when demands for reform of the Catholic Church of Rome began to grow in France. More immediate to the time of Montaigne's writing was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572, when thousands of Protestants died in the weeks that followed the wedding of Marguerite de Valois and Henry of Navarre. Montaigne refers to those days only obliquely here and elsewhere in the essays, only obliquely. He refers to our great disorders when there was neither law nor justice, nor any magistrate doing his duty, any more than now. And he also talks about the desolation of this state. I can't do justice to that passage now, but Montaigne's reaction to the threats and violence of his times, not only here, but often throughout the book, is, as I said earlier, a major answer for why we should read the essays in November 2024. And then listen to this offhand remark that Montaigne offers us on Vanity. Not because Socrates said it, but because it is really my humor, and perhaps excessively so, I consider all men my compatriots and embrace a Pole as I do a Frenchman, setting this national bond after the universal and common one. I think that was the sentence that when I first read this essay over 50 years ago made me want to spend my whole life reading Montaigne. The reception of his book must have been a major preoccupation as he approached both Paris in 1580 and Rome in 1581. In both cities, he had to present his book to formidable authorities for approval, to King Henry III in Paris and to the papal censors in Rome. He offers a beautiful tribute to that city, not to the Rome of the papal court, but to the city of antiquity, whose writers he had first tasted as a child. You remember that he tells us on the Education of Children that his first taste of books was the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses. His tribute to Rome is a double memento mori. I have seen elsewhere 20 ruined houses and statues both divine and human. It is always man we are dealing with. All that is true. I could not revisit the tomb of that great and mighty city so often that I would not marvel at it and revere it. The care of the dead is recommended to us. Now I've been brought up from childhood with these dead. I was familiar with the affairs of Rome long before I was with those of my own house. I knew the Capitol and its location before I knew the Louvre, and the Tiber before the Seine. I have had abilities and the abilities and fortunes of Lucullus, Metellus, and Scipio more in my head than those of any of our men. They are dead. So indeed is my father, as completely as they. And he has moved as far from me and from life in 18 years as they have in 1600. Nevertheless, I do not cease to embrace and cherish his memory, his friendship, and his society in a union that is perfect and very much alive. That's another passage that always stops me. The unexpected appearance of Montaigne's father in the midst of the ancient Romans, even though I now know to expect it, gives me a little shock, a little frisson of, of beauty. It's one of the many places in the essays that make me say we should read the essays today in 2024 because they're beautiful. Its rhymes and cadences, the evocative images of the Capitol and the Louvre, the Tiber and the Seine, and then that sudden eruption of mourning for his father, 18 years gone. His father, Pierre Echem, connects us back through Paris to the Chateau of Montaigne and the beginning of the essay. I said that we should read Montaigne because he encourages his readers to read widely and engage with books from the distant past as well as the present. And in these times when reading literature is undervalued more and more in our universities, when the humanities are in peril in those universities, we need Montaigne and his niaise humor, his silly humor, that he admits make him reproduce verbatim the papal bull of Roman citizenship that he was awarded when he presented his book to the Roman censors. And I guess after they had read it and approved the thing that he was preoccupied during his journey to Italy. That prestigious document, the Roman Bull of Citizenship, takes its name from the round drop of lead that sealed the document. But the word bulle in French, bulla in Latin, also means bubble. Since antiquity, bubbles, soap bubbles, have been a standard iconographical representation of the vanity topos. And here I'll ask Philip to show that second image. This is by Hendrik Goltzius, a bit later, but still in the same century. Quis evadit? Who avoids death? The little putti, the little child leaning on the death's head. Who avoids death? Remember that Montaigne tells us in On Vanity about his elusive manner of writing. Ce que je ne puis exprimer, je le montre au doigt. By his punning reference to the bull, he points his finger at Erasmus, whose adages, that sprawling compendium, and heavy compendium, and this is just part, of Greek and Roman proverbs, were those that the adages were one of the most widely read and influential books in the 16th century. His adage, homo bulla, man is just a bubble, appeared in the first collected edition of the adages in 1500, and as Erasmus went back to it and expanded it in later editions, and Erasmus did go back to it and expanded it in later editions, just as Montaigne expanded his essays from edition to edition. In retrospect, we see that Erasmus was here in this essay from the beginning. I'm not the first to note that Montaigne's ironic praise of vanity echoes Erasmus's praise of folly, although Montaigne never mentions the book by title in the essays. In his dedicatory letter to Thomas More, Erasmus claims to have written his praise of folly while traveling on horseback across the Alps from Italy into Northern Europe. Erasmus's journey traces the itinerary that the Renaissance itself followed from Italy into Northern Europe. Montaigne, also on horseback, retraces that itinerary in reverse, representing a journey back through history to its source. But there's more. For Montaigne's essay does not end in Rome. Its last paragraph takes us to Greece. Montaigne, like most Renaissance humanists, did not reach Greece. It remained for him a pays au-delà, a country beyond. But he gives the last words of his essays to the Delphic oracle. Know thyself. Look into yourself. Know yourself. Keep to yourself. Bring back your mind and your will, which are spending themselves elsewhere, into themselves. You are the fool of the farce, le badin de la farce. And with that, I stop for now. There are so many other wonderful passages in the essays that it grieves me to have to leave it like this, but I know it's there for you to go back to and savor and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for this beautiful reading of the essay and of 3-9 in particular. And I think the fact that you've used the word beautiful and beauty so many times today, I think is absolutely necessary for Montaigne. And I also know, listening to you, I wonder if you've inherited some of Montaigne's cadence too, or the rhythm. It's you have a fantastic cadence and rhythm.
Oh, thank you.
So anybody listening, please feel free to type in questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. and we'll get to those. I'll start off. I really it's impossible to read that I reread the chapter as I mentioned by email at the end of last week, sort of in preparation for the day, and was just again amazed by how much is in there. It's a chapter, as often with Montaigne, about everything, about
Yeah.
travel, about death, about vanity, obviously, about aging. And it's impossible for me to read the chapter now without seeing the image of the putti with the bubbles and so forth. It'll be impossible to unsee that, which is great because I worked on Récit de Pèlerinage at one point. And
Mhm.
it's true, right? Travel accounts and récits de pèlerinage sometimes did include documents to prove various points of the journey. So the fact that you had the right to go on this pilgrimages, or the fact that you'd actually arrived at the end of it, and so I think I'd always read the papal bull in 3-9 somewhat dryly, and I think you're absolutely right to show us actually what's happening.
I
Uh,
think he means it dryly. I mean, he says it's giving a little, giving into his niaise humor,
mhm,
his silly,
mhm,
silly, I don't know, there's probably a better word for niaise, but
mhm. No, absolutely. How so I really like how you show us landscape working in Montaigne generally, and in this chapter as well, and the importance of travel. Do the do you also see sort of the landscape alongside Vanitas paintings happening here? I mean, that's sort of
along what kind of landscapes?
alongside Vanitas paintings,
Oh,
the
yeah,
I know,
yes,
it's
yes.
an obvious point to make, but they're two
Yeah,
different kinds of
absolutely. That
painting.
that Goltzius is a vanitas,
Hmm.
and there's always in those paintings, there's always not always, but there's often a death's head.
Hmm.
There's often a vase of flowers, and I can't show these, but a friend sent me some flowers a couple days ago, and the flowers was are beautiful. They're lovely, but I can tell that they're starting to fade, to die. And the vases of flowers are often a leitmotif or I don't know, a topos, if you will, in vanitas paintings.
Mm. Relatedly to landscape and especially the one that you showed us at the start, I was really struck in rereading the chapter uh last week that where are my notes here? Just how much the word nature comes up in the chapter.
Yeah.
And it comes up in such interesting ways. There's a part where Montaigne says, "We must so live as not to struggle against nature in general." There's a bit when he's talking about the troubled times of the wars of religion, and he's talking about just wanting to escape from the tempest. But then he says, "Nature may lend me a hand." So may the hazards of war, but nature may lend me a hand. There's another generous nature um, when he's talking about Rome in his description of Rome, and he says even in her tomb, Rome still retains the sights and ghosts of empire. And then a quotation that says, "So that it should be obvious that in this one place nature delights in her work." And then at another point, when he's talking about vanity, and he says, nature can stop us staring at our own vanity. But then there are many other ones, but it's just really fascinating how, on the one
Yeah.
hand, there's, travel through landscapes, but then also a nature that's not just a nature you see, but a nature that's acting, right? A nature that's doing, a nature that's inhering within, which I don't know if that's something you've also thought about as well.
Yes, yes, and that yes, nature acting upon him. And I think again of that quotation that I gave first early in my talk that this great world of nature is the mirror in which we must look to find ourselves. Um, that's that's kind of echoed by the end of the chapter when the Delphic oracle says, look within yourself. So there's always that great connection that Montaigne expresses between himself and nature.
Absolutely. And this is a good segue to John O'Brien's question, which you can also read in the chat, Mary. I'm going to read it out loud, but if you click on Q&A, you'll be able to follow
I
along.
see them, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just read this out. So thank you for this, for your beautiful talk, Mary. At the end of 3:9 de la Vanité, why do you think Montaigne calls the commandment of the God of Delphi a paradoxical commandment? And how does this detail feed in with your reading of the chapter as part of the Vanitas tradition?
I have to confess that sometimes when I finish a talk, I have an enormous chute d'énergie, and I can't think anything clearly. But that question certainly deserves a careful answer.
No, I know the feeling.
Yeah, why is the putting the god of Delphi and the commandment to see yourself a paradoxical commandment? Well, I think for one thing, and maybe I'm repeating myself, that the god of Delphi at the end echoes that first section, that first passage that I read, where he says this great world is a mirror in which we have to look at the great variety of nature to know ourselves. I think putting it, well, at least putting it at the end gave me a sort of way to in case my talk by having that mirror at the beginning and both at the end. Why is it a paradoxical commandment? If by your question, John, you mean with the paradoxical nature of the Delphic oracle, well, there, I think that, well, I don't know if this will answer your question, and maybe I just can't, but I think the Greeks always considered the Delphic oracles pronouncements paradoxical. You could read them many different ways. And then later the Sibyls in Italian tradition, in Roman tradition, and I've been through one part of the early 16th century, their pronouncements were also paradoxical, so that they never just gave you an easy way out. I don't think I'm doing your question justice, John, but that's what I can think of now.
Thanks, Mary. Food for thought, and
Yeah, food for thought.
a future paper. Let me jump to another question. Let's go to Nancy Frelick, who thanks you for your talk, and then says, do you have any more thoughts about that wonderful image in De l'Éducation, which links paintings, mirrors, and books, and also the ways that it links in with the Delphic injunction to know thyself in De la Vanité? I'm asking for selfish reasons as I'm working on such images right now.
Oh, good. Well, I'll be glad to if you're working on images like that. I have a whole collection of those images. And Nancy, I'll get to your question, but the great disappointment about the publication of that second book, Les Terrains Vagues des Essais, was that Champion neglected to include the images, which I sent along with it. And I wrote to the editor beforehand and I said, should I get the permissions or will you get the permissions? And he wrote back and said, Je vais m'en occuper. Well, they weren't there when the book came out. And I believe I haven't seen the Garnier reproduction, but I think they're still not there. So in a way, it's a kind of paradoxical vanity, a kind of empty space in that book. So I do have lots of images, and maybe we can have a phone chat sometime, Nancy, about them. And so again, I think that that mirror image that he gives, that Montaigne gives in the education of children, um, it speaks, well, or the Delphic Oracle, I don't know, they speak to each other, if you like. I don't have this book right here to show you, but those great cosmic landscapes that were so popular in the Low Countries, Patinir, I don't know how you say his first name, Patinir, um, who's got a whole bunch of wonderful, colorful early landscapes, but then later the Bruegel ones and others. And I imagine there must have been French scholars who imitated those or who adapted them. And when Montaigne says at the beginning of De l'Amitié, when considering a painter in my study, and we've all recognized that that's a reference to Horace's Ars Poetica, that where he starts out with the same way. That Montaigne may have had images like that. Another kind of image that relates to or you could, I think, make it relate to the vanity topos, are those I guess they're engravings by the Italian artist Fantuzzi,
Mm.
where he gives you a sort of oval center, a vide, it's empty, there's nothing in it. And then he surrounds it with monstre fantasque and what are all sorts of strange monsters, chimère fantasque images, and that they are often used. Sometimes there's a large cosmic inside the oval is a large cosmic, maybe alpine landscape. So I do think all of those fit together. And by looking into that empty space, that's where the Delphic Oracle and Montaigne tells us that we have to look at ourselves. And I think it's just one short paragraph at the end of that essay after he's made that trajectory from his chateau to Paris, across the Alps, down to Rome, but then thinks beyond, um, beyond Rome to the land beyond. And then the great message of that Greek oracle is to look into yourself, and the mirror is one way that we can look at ourselves visually, if not it totally introspectively.
Let's jump to Jim Dallinger, who it's not exactly a question, but it could be a question. I liked the point that we have written more during the Troubles than at other times. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, there are a lot of places, and this giving this talk gave me the wonderful opportunity to go back and read not only my own work, but really read the essays
Mm.
that I talk about again. And there are so many places in there where sometimes without extending them very much, Montaigne gives almost a cry of dismay, desperation, although I don't think desperation is a good word, because I think he always ends with a note of maybe of hope or a note of something positive. But there are so many references, oblique sometimes references to the wars of religion. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre came just shortly after. Well, he retired in 1570, and we are told by scholars that research this better than I have, that he started writing the essays in 1572. We don't know what month he started writing the essays, but certainly that event, that horrible event in August of 1572, gave him a lot to write about. As I said, he never refers to it by name. He points his finger at it. I like very much George Hoffman's reading of the essay on De Cannibale, which draws us to see that Montaigne is pointing his finger at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the savage events that followed it.
Thanks, Mary. Let's jump to Wes Williams. I'll read out his comment. So I'm such an admirer of the intimacy and closeness of Mary's work, and agree with Philip about how she has taken on Montaigne's cadences in her reading. My question has to do with closeness. One, close reading as a practice, first, but two, what might it be about Montaigne's writing that gives us the sense that we can, even in November 2024, somehow get close to and intimate with both him and his work? It's a lovely question, Wes.
Oh yeah, that is a lovely question, and it's a challenge for teachers introducing students to Montaigne, because he is tough at the beginning. He's daunting, or can be, and I think we have to, in teaching. Well, I've been retired for 10 years, but I always encouraged students to stop at certain sentences of Montaigne, not only ones that I would suggest for them, but ones that when they were reading slowly and actually paying attention to the words, would strike them, just as that casual reference to liking to get to know Polish people when he's traveling, struck me many, many years ago. But most of the time when I was using English, I was drawing from Donald Frame's translation. And I think that he respects the cadences and the beauty of the poetry. And I think that hearing that, as you know, in as much as he can, it's not the same as the French, but hearing it, reading it in French, there's an intimacy in Montaigne's language. And I think that doesn't always happen in a classroom of 15 people. There might be some people who were falling asleep, other people who were looking, their brows furrowed. But in some of them, you could just see a spark catching, and that they were hooked. I remember one time a student said that this was a French student who said that when she started, she never thought she was going to like this very much. And then she said, "Mais maintenant, je suis emballée par Montaigne." So I love that. I love that students can still be emballés par Montaigne, the way we were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A question. We'll take a couple more questions, and then allow you to get a cup of tea and have a break here. So, a question from Alani Hicks Bartlett. She says, well, so thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Mary. Your presentation offers such a beautiful and moving reading of the essay. So I thank you firstly for that. And thank you for this focalization on de la vanité, which is such an important essay. I was just wondering if, on this question of landscape, you could please expand on your comment about the mountains in the Apologie.
Oh
If I
boy,
remember,
I don't have I have all these other books that I wanted to show you, how good health through Montaigne, and I don't have my copy of the essays here, and I hesitate to venture into it because I don't have that whole passage in
Mhm.
mind right now. Um,
No, absolutely.
but yeah,
She also just for future reference, Alani suggests also thinking about Montaigne's discussion of crumbling landscapes and shifting terrain, which
yeah.
you mentioned in passing des cannibales or unstable ground in des coches, but also the vertigo he feels in the Apology. So lots of food for thought there.
Oh, yes, very, very much so. And the business about the shifting, that wonderful image of the Dordogne, that we know is a meandering river shifting its banks. I think he says toward the south or toward, I forget toward what, um, is is such a wonderful image for the real world as well as the world that we see in those landscapes. Because in fact, the in ways that opened up new horizons, the new world was the pays au-delà par excellence, but that also, and horribly so, at the same time as there's this kind of move outward of discovery, as we know, it ended in terrible violence over there, as well as the violence that Montaigne was experiencing in in his own country. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think of as I was preparing this, I tried to watch a lot of I wanted to watch all of the previous conversations with Montaigne, but one that I went back to and would have hoped to use as somewhat of a model was Franck Lestringal's um, conversation where he talked about Descoches. And there too, there are those moments when violence erupts in that essay. Hmm. Well, you've all given me more questions to ponder myself, um, and maybe get back to you with.
I'm going to share one final comment or question for our list here, and then we'll close up. Richard Boyer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Vancouver, Canada, place with fantastic landscapes indeed, writes as follows. In the travel journal, Montaigne is leaving Innsbruck. Montaigne in leaving Innsbruck stops to look at a plaque from 1530 commemorating the meeting of Charles V and his brother Ferdinand. It
Yeah.
notes that they embraced there after not seeing each other for 8 years. Landscape and specific places can be locked down with something that is personal and even perhaps in itself banal. Is this an aspect of landscape in Montaigne that you would also see? Another thought for the list.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. And that I was so glad to see last month's or September's conversation, and to really peruse over and over again. I've looked so carefully, well, not as carefully as I should have, but I've spent a lot of time appreciating Nina Mugler's and her colleagues' edition of um, of the the journal, of the travel journal. And the fact that there are those images that go along with it illustrate the different works of art attached to the different places that Montaigne saw is just wonderful. And she makes the observation there that I maybe didn't make in this talk, that that landscape, that one I quoted, and I think that one is near Innsbruck. It's either when he's leaving Innsbruck or that one in the travel journal. She makes the observation that, in fact, the way the secretary described it is not geographically accurate. The one river doesn't really run into the other river. And the scholars who've worked with the cosmic alpine landscapes, the visual landscapes, have said it's tough to find a place where you could stand and really see what's shown in these pictures. These landscapes were created inside an artist's studio. So the artist wasn't out on a mountain path painting exactly what he could see. So the painting of the landscapes, as well as Montaigne's use of the landscapes, is that its importance is not to convey a realistic picture of what that place looked like. It's to convey the effect that it has on the viewer. And I think that's true in Montaigne really rarely goes into any great detail about a certain place that he's looking at and describing it realistically. His landscape references are artistic creations, just as the Bruegels and other landscapes are.
Mhm. Thank you, Mary. Okay, I'm just gonna read out two questions. If you don't feel obliged to answer them, I'm just gonna put them out there so we've got them for on our list here, and then we'll close up as time is passing. But so Nadine Couperti asked the question: Est-ce qu'on ne tombe pas trop souvent dans le piège d'un texte soi-disant associatif alors qu'il est en réalité très construit? So do we fall into the trap of talking about a text that's associative when in reality it's very constructed? And I think you've shown how constructed Montaigne's texts are.
Yeah, it took me a while to see that. Um, but I go back to it, and I think it's true that it's not by accident that he talks about the places that his actual journey passed through or stayed in and remained in. In, in and he reproduces in the essay that itinerary that goes up to Paris, that I didn't quote, but I think you all know, if you've read that essay, you all know how beautiful that brief hymn of praise to Paris is in the middle of the essay, and then continues on down. But then kind of unexpectedly, not ending there. And where is he gives that praise of Paris, his praise of Rome, as I recall, the hymn of praise of Paris is actual Paris, the Paris that he knows and that he's been in. But the praise of Rome is not a praise of papal Rome at all. It's a praise of antiquity. And the bit about papal Rome is the bull that he adds on there, as he says, as a joke on himself. So yes, I don't think I've responded exactly, but my thought resonates with Nadine Couperti's very much there. Let's see, is there another one? This is not a question.
Anita Sherman, and this is a good place for us to to conclude, it's a nice moment of éloge. Thank you, Mary, for this lovely talk. I've learned so many things: the Erasmian subtext, the emblem of the bulle, the permeable bond between travel and books, and the way she singled out key phrases, le pays au-delà and la route par ailleurs, and much more. Thank you. I had never realized that perhaps the writing of the essays as a whole were a response to the Saint Barthélemy. Of course, I see it now. It's a nice summary of some of the things we've learned today. So thank you. Thank you so much, Mary, for being with us. I've really appreciated
Thank you,
time.
Philip, very much for this and your whole series of conversations. They're really important today.
That's kind of you. Thank you, Mary, so much. It was a pleasure to reread you for this episode and to reread Montaigne, which is one of the things I love about this series. It gets me reading, and it was a true joy to learn from you today. So thank you. Thank you, everybody who joined us on Zoom. This is the final episode of Conversations with People Who Read Montaigne for this semester, and indeed the final episode until September 2025, as we'll be on a break in the spring. When they're available, details of future episodes will be posted at montaigne.us. All episodes of this series are available online. You can consult them as well as accompanying materials such as summaries and bibliographical references. Maybe I'll add in some images for Mary's talk. You can access all of this by going to montaigne.us. It remains for me to thank the Maison Française of New York University, especially François Nudelman and Courtney Rutherford, the Department of French Literature, Thought and Culture and its chair, Emily Apter, and NYU's Medieval and Renaissance Center and its director, Eugenio Refini. And especially thank you, Mary, and thank you all who joined us today. Take care, everybody.